Good morning. I think you've heard enough about how to design a consensus protocol that is better than Bitcoin. Let's learn how to design a consensus protocol that is worse than Bitcoin. So the title of this talk is it's very long. Why is that? Why not just analyzing Bitcoin Unlimited? Because I want to present something that is valuable even if Bitcoin Unlimited is never deployed. That is valuable beyond this simple case. By the way, I really hope it is never deployed. So in Bitcoin, we have prescribed block validity consensus. What does that mean? That means a block is either valid or invalid to all the miners. Let's recall the Bitcoin mining protocol, which is covered by the last speaker. Once upon a time, there was a genesis block. Every block after this block needs to have a predecessor. And sometimes multiple blocks are going to be mined with the same predecessor. We call this situation a fork. In a fork, Bitcoin's fork resolving policy demands that all miners mine on the longest chain, or the first received block during a tie. Eventually, one chain will be longer than the others, and all blocks that are not in this longest chain are abandoned by all the miners. We call these blocks orphaned. Orphaned blocks receive no reward. However, there is a problem. Bitcoin cannot scale. Let's consider transactions per second, the most important metric in a payment system. In Visa, that number is 2,000. In Alipay, that number reaches 120,000. This record was created in Double 11 Shopping Festival. In Bitcoin, that number is less than 4, because Bitcoin's mining protocol demands that one block is created every 10 minutes, and the block size cannot exceed 1 megabyte. People disagreed on how to fix it. Here comes Bitcoin Unlimited. What is it? It's a tool to raise the block size limit without splitting the network. We'll see about that. And how does it achieve its goal? Bitcoin Unlimited believes the block size limit should never have been a consensus rule in the first place. Miners in Bitcoin Unlimited decide the block size limit collectively through a deliberative process. Who supported it? It is supported by the largest mining power, which is around 40%, until late June 2017. BU supporters and objectors have a nasty fight. So they even threatened to fork the network once they reach more than 50% of the mining power. So we were really close to a split at that time. And they claim they have prepared to launch a 51% attack against the original Bitcoin once they forked. So how does it work? In BU mining protocol, every miner broadcasts a maximum acceptable block size, EB, which is a local choice. That's why I say in BU there is no block validity consensus, because a block that is valid to some miners may be invalid to other miners. To prevent a miner from mining indefinitely on a chain that is abandoned by the rest of the network, there's an extra mechanism called AD. As long as the length of a chain starting with a larger than EB block reaches a certain length, which is AD, the miner accepts the chain. In this example, AD equals 3. Moreover, once AD is reached, the miner opens a sticky gate and accepts large blocks until 144 consecutive small blocks appear. In the left figure, as you can see, there is a larger than EB block. So despite the fact that this block is actually in the longest chain, the miner will ignore this block and consider it invalid and keep mining on this block because it's larger than the miner's local EB. However, as long as the chain starting with this block reaches the miner's AD value, which is 3, the miner will accept this block and acknowledge it as the longest chain and keep mining on the latest block. So why do they think this will work? The rationale of BEU is called emergent consensus. They believe economic factors can drive miners to the same EB, which is the actual network capacity. So is this scheme vulnerable to attacks? They believe attacks will cost the attacker far more than the victim. We'll see about that. After reading basically everything BU project members have written, we have 2 observations. The first one is there are different security claims among BU supporters. Some of them believe that block validity consensus is not necessary for security. Namely, even if all miners choose different EB value, the network is still secure. And others believe that, okay, if BVC is absent, the network is not secure, but BVC will emerge automatically. Actually, there's a third kind of opinion, that is, BVC will be formed or driven by attacks. We don't consider that opinion seriously. It's like saying that you can put your money in our bank, and your money will be safe for 1 day after every robbery. Another observation is BU supporters and objectors have different incentive models. Supporters believe that all miners are compliant and profit-driven, whereas objectors claim that you should consider arbitrary adversary. What we did in this research is that we evaluate the 2 security claims made by BU supporters within 3 different incentive models. The 2 claims are BU is secure when BVC is absent, and BVC will emerge. And the incentive models are compliant and profit-driven, non-compliant and profit-driven, and non-profit-driven. As we said before, discussing whether BVC will emerge under attack is not very meaningful. So to evaluate the first security claim, we use the following technical approach. For each incentive model, we pick a most famous attack and define the attacker's goal or utility. We evaluate the effectiveness of these attacks in a most simple BVC is absent setting, namely 2 different EBs and 1 small attacker. Just to be clear, this is the weakest setting. More EB values in the network will only benefit the attacker. And we compute the optimal strategy and the utility of the attacker within each incentive model. This is the main technical challenge of the paper. And we compare the results with those of Bitcoin. Here's the setting. There are 3 groups of miners, Alice, Bob, and Carol, with mining power share alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha plus beta plus gamma equals 1 because they are mining power share. And alpha is no bigger than the smaller one between beta and gamma. Bob and Carol have the same AD, which is 6. They have the same block size, EB Bob, which is smaller than EB Carol. Alice may mine blocks of size EB Bob, EB Carol, or larger than EB Carol to strategically split Bob and Carol to different chains. Alice is the strategic miner, or in some cases, Alice is the attacker. Here's an example. Alice mined a block which is larger than EB Bob, which is EB Carol, so that Carol will think of it as a valid block and keep mining on top of it, whereas Bob will ignore this block and consider it as an invalid block. By mining a block of size EB Carol, Alice successfully split the mining power of Bob and Carol. Here's another example. When Bob's sticky gate is open, Bob will accept blocks of any size. In that case, Alice can mine a block that is larger than EB Carol, so that Bob will think of it as a valid block, whereas Carol will reject the block. Is that clear? Okay. So the first incentive model. The goal of compliant and profit-driven Alice is to maximize the block reward share without deviating from the protocol, namely no selfish mining, no double spending. Here's a typical execution. Alice mined a block of EB Carol so that Carol will think of it as a valid block and keep mining on top of it, whereas Bob will reject the block. Eventually, this chain becomes longer so that Bob will abandon his own block and start mining on this chain. In this execution, Alice orphans 2 Bob's blocks by mining an EB Carol block. Alice's relative block reward increases from 1/8 to 1/6. So without the attack, Alice can get 1 block out of 8 blocks. But with the attack, because these 2 blocks are orphaned, Alice gets 1 block out of 6 main chain blocks. So here are the results. So what does the numbers mean in this table? Each column represents a mining power share of Alice, and each row represents a mining power ratio between Bob and Carol. For example, this number means Alice controls 10% of the total mining power, and Bob and Carol have equal mining power. Namely, Alice controls 10%, Bob controls 45%, Carol controls 45%. And the number means Alice's relative block rewards. In this entry, Alice can get 10% of the block reward, which is fine, right? Because if you have 10% of mining power, you're expected to have 10% of the block rewards. However, as you can see, for many entries in this table, the relative block reward is higher than the mining power share. In this entry, with 25% of mining power, Alice can actually get 27% of all the block rewards, which means BO mining protocol is not incentive compatible, even if all miners are compliant. For the second incentive model, the goal of non-compliant and profit-driven Alice is to maximize the block reward plus double spending reward. Here's a typical execution. In this example, Alice put a double spending transaction in block B1 and put a conflicting version of the transaction in this A1 block. So as the mining proceeds, both chains grow, and Alice mined a block, eventually A2, to make sure that this transaction got confirmed, and Alice got the goods delivered by the merchant. However, eventually this chain becomes the longest chain, so that the entire chain is orphaned. Note that in this example, Alice mined a block that is eventually orphaned to help it reach 5 confirmation. I know it's supposed to be 6. It's because of a bug in my program. I will fix it later. So here are the results of the optimal strategy. The numbers in the tables are the expected mining plus double spending reward Alice can receive every 10 minutes in the unit of block reward. For example, this entry means for every 10 minutes, Alice can get 0.01 block reward, which is fine because if you have 1% of the total mining power, you get 1% of all the blocks, and every 10 minutes you're expected to have 0.01 block reward. However, as you can see, for many entries in this table, the utility of Alice is a lot larger than its fair share of block rewards. In this entry, Alice can get almost 0.1 block reward every 10 minutes. The extra reward is due to double spending. Whereas when you look at the optimal double spending plus selfish mining attack in Bitcoin, the attacker is not profitable with less than 15% of mining power, which means double spending is much easier and much more profitable in Bitcoin Unlimited. For the third kind of incentive model, A non-profit-driven Alice's goal is to orphan as many Bob and Carol's blocks as possible with the least number of Alice's blocks. Here's a typical execution. Alice mined a block of EB Carol, and eventually this chain got abandoned because Bob's chain grows faster, and Carol abandoned his own block. In this example, Alice only mined one block. However, she successfully orphaned two honest blocks mined by Carol. So here are the results. As you can see, for many entries in the table, it is larger than 1. Whereas, as you know, in Bitcoin, if you want to orphan one honest block, you have to pay for one attacker block. That number is always 1, or sometimes less than 1. However, in Bitcoin Unlimited, in many settings, Alice can orphan more than one block with each attacker's block. Therefore, we can conclude that Bitcoin Unlimited will cost the attacker far more than the victim. So far we know that when BVC is absent in all 3 incentive models, the security of BU is worse than Bitcoin. So the remaining question is, will BVC emerge even if all miners are compliant and profit-driven? We answer this question by analyzing 2 games. The first one, we call it EB choosing game. The setting is miners can choose from 2 EB values, and the EB value chosen by more than half of the mining power is the winner. All rewards are shared among miners who choose the winner. In this simple setting, there's a very simple equilibrium. That is, all miners choose the same EB. A Nash equilibrium means that no one can deviate from the equilibrium and get higher reward, higher utility. This equilibrium is quite straightforward because when all other miners choose the same EB value, if you choose a different one, your blocks will be orphaned. The implication of this equilibrium is that when all miners can choose any EB value, there is a Nash equilibrium in which a consensus is reached, which is desirable, right? However, this is just an imaginary world. In the real world, miners can have different preferences. In this second game, we call it the block size increasing game. Every miner has a maximum profitable block size. If most blocks in the main chain is larger than MPB, the miner is forced to leave the game. We don't care about why they have different preferences. What we do care is that they have different preferences, which is the reason why BU allows miners to signal their EB value. Otherwise, why not just having no block size limit at all? Miners with large MPBs might form a coalition to raise the block size and kick others out. They will succeed if the coalition can choose more than 50% of mining power. And eventually, rewards are shared among those who survive until the end. So the question is, will they raise the block size limit? Unfortunately, the answer is they usually do. Consider this example. There are 4 groups of miners. Miner group 1, 2, 3, and 4. Miner group 1 can choose 10% of the mining power. Miner group 2 can choose 20% of the mining power. 3, 30%, 4, 40%. And miner group 1 prefers the smallest block size, and miner group 4 prefers the biggest block size. So a rational choice for all these miners is to raise the block size limit, to kick miner group 1 out of the business. So in the first round, miner group 2, 3, and 4 will vote to increase the block size. However, in the second round, because if they kick miner group 2 out, miner group 4 will kick miner group 3 out. So miner group 2 and 3 will vote against increasing the block size. And the game terminates. In most initial settings, the block size will be increased. To understand this, you can think of Bitcoin Unlimited provide a tool for miners to form a coalition of 51% of the mining power to kick the other 49% out of the business. so that they can get larger share of block rewards. So here is the summary of our results. Is BU secure when BVC is absent? The answer is no. New attack vectors in BU weakens BQueen security within all three incentive models. And will BVC emerge even if all miners are compliant? No. BVC will not emerge in most occasions. And even when a BVC is reached and all miners are compliant, the BVC is very fragile. Strong miners have both the incentive and the ability to break BVC, raise the block size for higher reward share. If that is too long to remember, you can just remember their slogan. Bitcoin Unlimited, release the potential. Okay. So all the previous analysis focus on the consensus, whether they can reach the same EB value. Let's consider the other dimension of the problem. What does it mean to have larger block? Intuitively, larger blocks means lower fees, which is a better thing. However, that also means more transactions in the network, which is harder to quantify. So if we have two megabyte blocks, what's the estimated fee? And what's the number of transactions that will emerge? We don't know. And it also means higher percentage of small transactions, which is also hard to quantify. Higher number of transactions and higher percentage of small transactions means that for public nodes, they will have to spend more bandwidth and more bandwidth per byte because small transactions consumed significantly larger bandwidth per byte than large transactions. And higher verification cost and higher memory consumption because the UTXO, it will be unspent transaction output will consume more memory. Do we really want to find out via trial and error? What if strong miners won't listen to public nodes? So the takeaway message from this talk is that we are all Jon Snow, not because we are brothers of the watch, because we know nothing about consensus protocol. Is prescribed BVC indispensable? Maybe not. As long as we can prove that the system is secure against more than 50% of attacker, so that by abandoning prescribed BVC, we do not introduce any extra security assumptions. And we know nothing about consensus protocol. We don't have a consensus on the definition of decentralization and the definition of what is a valid consensus protocol. One interesting way to think of consensus protocol is that it has two phases, one rule setting phase and execution phase. The goal of Bitcoin Unlimited is to decentralize the rule setting phase so that every miner can set the rule. However, that will lead to a more centralized execution phase. So maybe a trade-off is that let's have a relatively centralized rule setting phase in order to have a decentralized execution phase. And we don't know how to evaluate consensus protocol security. And we don't have a consensus on the design principles and elements of consensus protocols. For example, can we use timestamp to design consensus protocols? If we can we use timestamp on the blockchain only, or can we use miner's local timestamp? If we can use miner's local timestamp, what's the granularity? These questions are not answered in the field. Thank you. That will be all.